Hello and welcome to the program. This is another podcast for The Diplomat, and with me is David Totten. David is a financial analyst with Emerging Markets Consulting, EMC, based mainly out of Cambodia, but he does do a lot of work around the region. David, welcome to the program.
Hi Luke, nice to be here.
We're a year down in terms of the pandemic, and a year ago the world was divided between those who thought it'd be a short-term thing and those who saw the realities. The rollout of the vaccines do seem to be making a difference, but I don't think anybody thinks that will spell the silver bullet for the end of the COVID pandemic. Where do you see things unfolding over Southeast Asia over the next 6 months?
Over the next 6 months?
Or longer out, it's up to you.
Yeah, I would say next 6 months is kind of difficult to forecast where things go in the short term. Mainly because so much is linked to the availability of a vaccine. It's not manufactured in ASEAN, so a lot of countries here are depending on being able to go and get stocks in from other countries. Where we currently are in Cambodia, we're getting them in from China and from India, which make the AstraZeneca vaccine under license.
And it's there's long queues for AstraZeneca, and the government has noted the queues for the Chinese Sinopharm are somewhat shorter, and that's causing disruptions in getting the vaccinations out to where they need to go. You're basically saying that really everything's on hold until the vaccinations are rolled out, until everybody gets an inoculation, or?
I wouldn't say it's on hold, but basically, everybody's going to be making long-term plans. In ASEAN, that's going to be around developing the manufacturing base, accelerating the digital revolution, growing the economies generally, further integration, becoming a attractive destination for FDI. So long-term plans really don't change that much. I think everybody expects that we will get over Corona, but exactly when that happens, that is subject to a great deal of uncertainty. Going back to what we were discussing before, there's also the issue of vaccine, what's the right term, fails me, vaccine policy, or vaccine diplomacy rather.
Sure,
so you've got China. I think ASEAN is the recipient, the largest external recipient.
Certainly one of the first,
of Chinese
1 million
vaccines.
doses coming.
America notably isn't providing vaccines overseas at the moment, but with the progress they're making under the Biden administration's current plans, we would expect that they will plan to start doing so a few months down the line.
I noticed that the Quads meeting between the United States, India, Japan and Australia, they just announced that a lot more money, I think tens and hundreds of $1 million is going to be earmarked for countries like Cambodia to ensure vaccine supplies. We're obviously kind of stalemated. I know, for instance, expats around the region struggling to know what to do, where to go, how to get their vaccination. So assuming we get through this, I mean, some of the interesting economic angles to emerge out of the pandemic is digital currencies, which you mentioned before. What's happening in Cambodia in terms of de-dollarization, the introduction of Bekong as a central bank digital currency for transferring money. These sorts of things, how are they going to help improve trade relations even within countries within ASEAN, facilitating business, facilitating trade?
Well, digital currency in ASEAN is going to be a key component of facilitating cross-border e-commerce.
Right.
So that will be a great help. Going back to your comments regarding Cambodia, Cambodia is really leading on the central bank digital currency front. It should be noted that the NBC themselves are on record as saying it's not a currency. It's not something that you or I can go and trade or deal in. It is better looked at as advanced digital infrastructure that will facilitate interbank payments and eventually extending financial inclusion to the whole country.
This has been a big aspect with the Cambodian economy, where I think they refer to it as the unbanked, but it's also people who rarely use a bank, and the percentage of the 16 million people in Cambodia, that's about 70%. It's quite a high number.
Yeah, indeed it is. Yeah, if you can't if you can't pay for things online,
right,
then you can't join the digital economy. If you can't join the digital economy, then you're missing out, basically, and potentially the countries that have a large number of their consumers or citizens are not participating in it is going to be left behind in terms of their own economic development.
What's the potential for the economic? Is there a numbers game on how many people or how much money could be brought into the banking system? I mean, there was one figure I saw that in 2019, $60 billion was transferred around the country through different payment options. That's a lot of money for a country like Cambodia, and given that 70% of the population rarely uses a bank, there's obvious, I can see why economists and bureaucrats are hoping this will give the economy a lift, particularly in the pandemic era.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Cambodia actually has reasonable progress in money transfers.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the guys listening to the program will be familiar with M-Pesa. Who isn't? That was rolled out in Africa, originally developed by Vodafone and considered to be one of the first major digital payment systems. In Cambodia, we have a similar company, Wing.
Mm-hmm.
We've been well established now for about 10 years, I would like to say. But that really doesn't represent digital finance in the sense we talk about it now.
Right.
A lot of guys will use that service as a straightforward substitute for like traditional ways, like sending money from A to B to a relative at the other end of the country or whatever. Not tending to use it a lot for more sophisticated services, accessing e-commerce,
right,
and so forth. So Cambodia has a strong basis to go and move forward, but what they need to do is onboard those existing customers to more sophisticated services.
Right.
And when they can do that, then it becomes the driver of e-commerce.
One more question on that, and just a quick note that Laos is following the Cambodian lead on central bank backing of instruments like Bakong. It seems to me that these are being favoured by the least developing economies within ASEAN, where the more advanced economies, say Singapore, for example, they've got an entrenched banking system, it's first world. Is it more of a case that digital currencies like Bakong, I'll take that back, digital infrastructure like Bakong, which facilitates payments and is backed by the central bank, does it make sense that these are being favoured by the more least developed countries?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Luke. It's more difficult for advanced countries with established, pretty well functioning infrastructure.
Right.
It's more complex to go and move to a completely different system, and insofar as the existing system is kind of working is working okay, the marginal gains are not necessarily there. So it's more expensive and less beneficial. But you take a country like Cambodia, and there's other examples around the world, the infrastructure isn't there, so the marginal gains are substantially higher.
Right.
And they don't have an existing system to the same extent that they need to migrate, and so it's a great opportunity for them to leapfrog. And leapfrogging is a concept we talk about a lot, these things, but in many cases...
Skipping the curve is another one.
It's that very difficult to achieve in many cases, but in this case, looks like Cambodia and other countries are doing a good job of doing exactly that.
Okay. China, the ever-present force in Southeast Asia that was growing exponentially, particularly before the pandemic, is obviously going to be shaping the region policy and economics going into the post-COVID era, perhaps. How has relationships changed with China? There's been, as you mentioned earlier, the vaccine diplomacy. We know relations are strained around the region, including in Cambodia, which had once been described as China's best ally in the region. How do you see it going forward?
Well, ASEAN depends on China for a lot, right? I mean, China is the largest source of FDI, it's the largest source of trade, not the only source. China, US, Europe jointly account for over 50% of external trade with ASEAN, but China is number one amongst those three. So, yeah, there's corona vaccine diplomacy going on, but ASEAN is somewhat I don't want to say entirely dependent, but obviously China is a hugely valuable partner for them. They're going to continue to rely on them. And like Chinese incentive is extremely obvious. If you look at the ASEAN region in general, by 2050, it's expected to be fourth largest trading bloc in the world, and with China being number one, India being, I can't remember, number two or number three. The world's moving towards, in 30 years from now, the world will be Asia-centric, and China want to go and be the number one player in the number one geographic region.
Right, and rising discontent with China, particularly among local countries, is that creating another in for, say, Western powers into the region? Particularly, Barack Obama was criticised for doing too little too late. Donald Trump was criticised for ignoring the region. Joe Biden does seem to be taking a more active involvement in Southeast Asia, and that was highlighted with the Quad meeting, which took place last week, again with India, Japan and Australia, as opposed to talking to China first. What sort of opportunities are there, given there seems to be this sort of lull in Chinese expansion into the region? If that's right, that might be the wrong word, but
I mean, looking at the long-term future of Asia and ASEAN within it, like a small lull here or there of like 1 year or so
right.
is it's a bit of a speed bump, right? Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things. ASEAN obviously is not populated by what the US or the Europeans or the Brits, now that we're no longer in Europe, would consider vibrant democracies.
Right.
And in that context, sometimes it's difficult to assess genuinely how impactful public sentiment is. Like the man on the street in Philippines or in Vietnam or in Singapore, in terms of doing stuff. Set that aside. I mean, I'm sure it's important, right? It's just difficult to assess, or is not possible to assess in the same way we might do so over in the UK or Europe or whatever.
That's true. Well, opinion polls are banned in many countries in the region, and certainly in Cambodia. So that that's a factor on that one. We are seeing that the rise to authoritarianism over the last 3-4 years. Looking at what's happened in Myanmar since the coup, February 1. There's a lot of Chinese infrastructure there. The Russians have wanted an in with Myanmar. They see access to ports and trade routes as well. So you're seeing the sort of short and medium term, perhaps there's nothing that can't be resolved?
Yeah, I mean, certainly like the governments in the region, they all have their own security concerns. There probably is a general sentiment that China, when it is entering like trade deals, is perhaps not such a generous partner. Right. In terms of the deal they're looking for.
And will it honour the contract?
Yeah, people looked at the RCEP agreement, which sort of was a bit of a new splash a short time ago, but it doesn't go as deep as other trade agreements. America has tended to be pretty generous when it comes to opening up their market, which is obviously the real carrot for ASEAN economies. And I think there's probably a general slightly distrustful sentiment amongst ASEAN governments that China doesn't like to do that, right? And so, getting away from the whole issue about public sentiment, which I think is important, but is not perhaps important in the same way as it is in US, Europe, Britain, Australia, and so forth. Governments have their own self-interest and the interest of their populations and their economic development, and China is hugely important because it will be the largest economy relatively soon. Some say it's the largest economy already, and so you can't ignore it, right? And neither should they. I mean, but will there be at the back of their minds, caveat emptor, a sort of a concern about what they do? Do they want to have another viable partner to go and stand up with whom they can also do trade agreements, also relying for investment, like EU or America? Absolutely.
Okay.
Going back to the issue you raised briefly on Myanmar, ASEAN really isn't like the EU, and obviously they are extremely reticent for members of ASEAN to go and comment publicly on the affairs of any of the individual states. If you look at, you look at Myanmar currently before I'm going to make a huge mistake and say
the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, ICJ. Thank you for that. I was going to say ICC for a bit. I mean, that case was brought by the Gambia, right?
Right.
It wasn't brought by one of the Muslim states in ASEAN. So, for a long-term ASEAN watcher like yourself, you're really looking at much more finely graduated nuances in terms of how member states react to the situation in Myanmar than, for example, we would expect if something was happening in Central Europe or Eastern Europe. You'd see stronger statements coming out of, for example, the EU or America, right? And ASEAN member states generally are quite reticent to do that.
Right. When Europe has found itself in trouble, the issues with the Balkans, the issues with Northern Ireland to a much lesser extent, they've been able to engage in outside help, and they've put boots on ground. One would argue they have been shy in using military force, but that does not seem to be an option for Myanmar, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's the United Nations, and certainly whether it's the West.
Yeah, I can't see military force being on the table. I mean, it's just wouldn't come from ASEAN. Would it come from the US? I think Joe Biden might well personally want to do a trade deal with ASEAN, but probably has a whole load of other public policy priorities back in the US, right? He needs to sort out the economic impacts of COVID, which he has just done, and he wants to go on for infrastructure. I think he's pretty nervous about putting TPP on the table in the US, right? Yeah. So if he's nervous about that, he's going to be pretty nervous about defending global democracy in Myanmar.
Right.
EU obviously won't do anything. They struggle on, generally on these big geopolitical issues. They still struggle, for example, to come up with a kind of common view on Russia's gas pipelines to Germany, for example. So, you can't see them doing much. Obviously, China appears to be very interested in Myanmar for geopolitical reasons, and couldn't really see anybody, under that circumstance.
Do you think Russia could be reasserting itself in the region? Are you seeing any signs of that? I mean, the Russians were here in big numbers, probably 2 or 3 times over the last 20 years. They bailed around 2014 when the ruble collapsed. Do you think that there's scope, given... I think what I'm getting at is the pandemic is creating a vacuum, politically, economically, different bubbles around the region. And if there's a vacuum, it creates scope for others to come in and fill the void. And Russia, it's too smart to ignore this part of the world. And it's... I
mean, Russia's got a long history, going back to the 19th century of, some of this overseas adventurism, right? You go back in a long history, none of it ever particularly came off, but, they would have been nosing around in Africa to see whether they could get a bit of the European grand game down there. And I think I used to live in Russia for 4 years during the 90s, and it has changed a great deal. Russia is not an economically powerful nation. It is militarily powerful because they've got lots of nukes exclusively.
And that is one area where they've been making inroads, particularly military sales, hardware to Vietnam, some to Laos, and certainly to Myanmar, where the generals kind of see Russia as an alternative to China. It's a ghastly thought, right? But obviously, I was about to say you can't really build strong perpetual diplomatic relations on selling armaments to a country. But obviously, if the country is large enough and it descends into a perpetual state of war, then certainly your ability and your desire to provide weaponry to one side or the other becomes a very significant tool. We saw that in Syria.
Yeah.
We've seen it in Afghanistan and certainly the old Soviet republics. As we emerge out of the pandemic, and given what I was saying in regards to vacuums and voids, what industries do you see going ahead, thriving even in the kind of post-pandemic era, and what type of government policies are needed to encourage those areas of growth?
Well, I would say my general view is that COVID is obviously hugely impactful event in the short term. In the long term, it doesn't fundamentally alter those key drivers in the ASEAN economy. It's large already, with a very large working age population and a very young demographic. It's growing fast, as we said earlier on. It's expected to be the world's fourth largest country or trading bloc.
About half a billion people, I think.
By 2050, absolutely. And as a result of those factors I just went to mention. So that probably isn't going to change. Assuming, as you all do at the moment, that the vaccines create a durable or manageable situation around coronavirus, and we're not at the end, not at the beginning of some new apoplectic world order where viruses ravage the global community every 5 years or so.
Right.
So the key drivers for ASEAN as they get richer and richer will be to continue expansion of manufacturing. So it's already extremely important driver of the economy, but manufacturing itself is going through an evolution. The fourth industrial revolution, as some people like to call it. So for ASEAN, they need to go and shift their comparative advantage from abundant, relatively cheap labour to much more sophisticated IT-driven manufacturing.
Right, so that's pushing into the advanced economies.
Yeah, absolutely. And as they will develop, services become increasingly important. They're already very important. I think it counts for about, on average, 50% of ASEAN GDP. So that will expand greatly. In the short term, tourism has obviously been hugely impacted. So
I was going to ask you about that next.
They'll have to come up with policies to recover. It's obviously relatively unequal across the whole of ASEAN. It's Thailand and Cambodia are hugely impacted by COVID.
Right. Where Indonesia has been isolated to places like Bali, but not necessarily the entire economy. Myanmar, the coup has overtaken events there. I think the Philippines is basically shut down, but tourism had sort of lagged there for quite a few years after Rodrigo Duterte initiated his war on drugs. Laos remains Laos. I can see the smile on your face. Things don't change despite the rhetoric. Malaysia, there seems to be some political stability there with the new government, and Singapore is forever in the corner, basically pushing its standards and being a major behind-the-scenes operator.
Absolutely. And I mean, worth bearing in mind that going into COVID, a few of the main tourism destinations are already having some challenges, right? In Cambodia and Thailand, the tourist market been shifting quite dramatically.
Right.
A lot more Chinese tourists coming in, and they have a very, very different spending pattern to European tourists or American tourists or from other countries, potentially spending less money in the country. Or we saw the rise of this zero-cost tourism, which was troubling quite a lot of people. And I think actually Thailand got into trouble with China over that.
Well, they tried to ban it, Bali as well.
Exactly. So there were troubles going into it, and it's interesting to wonder, as it re-emerges, how much we fundamentally changed, right? Some of it may be.
Well, within the economies and the different sectors, I mean, it takes a long time to skill people up for say, tourism or for manufacturing. People are leaving one sector and trying to find work in another. Okay, it's limited, but it's going to be difficult to get that back. Do we need it back anyway? Tell me a little bit more about the fourth industrial revolution. It's quite intriguing in many ways in terms of, will that necessarily lead to stronger exports, or are we going to be looking at stronger manufacturing at homes, whether it's making cars or garment manufacturing or household appliances?
That is a difficult question. There seems to be so many opinions floating around the fourth industrial revolution. I guess the majority of the opinion is behind the idea that this is going to be a major change, hence the term revolution. There's still a few voices around who still not quite clear on impact. I think a number of things are probably fairly clear. Less employment in manufacturing, those people who are fortunate to be employed in it will need substantially higher skills. They move from being essentially work that is manual orientated towards work which is intellect orientated, for want of a better word. That it will be a significant shift in a part of the world where you have a very young demographic, and those people will need jobs as they get older.
And they're increasingly becoming more educated with university degrees, and they want a certain type of job.
Yeah. So you need a lot of jobs, whilst traditional manufacturing, shrinking the traditional manufacturing base is like reducing the number of jobs. So yeah, I mean, ASEAN probably wants to become manufacturing hub for the world and exporting that product, as China perhaps declines a bit in that area due to its rising cost base.
We used to call it the world's factory floor. Does that no longer apply?
I guess it depends a bit where you are in China, and I think depending on how you measure it, if you include all the cost factors, there are certainly places in China that would still qualify as low cost. You know, the cost of infrastructure, the benefits of being in a cluster, the reduced logistics costs that come as a result of that, tighter integrated supply chains, right? If you factor all that in, there's still parts of China which are substantially low cost, but other parts which are substantially high cost. There are other countries that will eye that economic opportunity, Vietnam being an obvious one, right? They have obviously nowhere near as big as China, but they have a large workforce, like most of the countries in ASEAN, a very young demographic. They've just negotiated this great trade deal with Europe, giving access to markets, and so one would expect them to be substantial beneficiaries.
So your longer term prognosis, perhaps we should wait and see how the virus behaves once the vaccine has been rolled out in 6 months' time. But your longer term prognosis seems to be a lot more optimistic than quite a few other people that I've spoken with.
Yeah, I would say it is, but the optimism or pessimism is kind of, is based on certain assumptions about the world, right? People over the last few years, even before coronavirus kicked off, have looked around a world that seems to be fragmenting in a geopolitical sense.
Sure, globalization was already in retreat before COVID.
And so if you look at, if you look at that and you see that as an irreversible trend, that's going to undermine a lot of assumptions you might make about the growth in ASEAN, or to be frank, the growth in anywhere, right? ASEAN is going to be largely export driven, moving to advanced manufacturing, but if they can't export their stuff, then that kind of undermines that economic pathway, right? So yeah, I tend to be in the glass half full, in the sense that I don't see the world geopolitically irrevocably fragmenting. I obviously and unfortunately stand to be corrected. We'll wait and see what happens over the next couple of years. It would be great, of course, if the American political situation, and linked to that, public sentiment there, somewhat stabilizes. And that will give a lot of countries, including ASEAN, a source of stability, or a counterweight in the world.
And on that note, David Totten, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Luke.
Cheers, mate.